Commander Jake Morrison stood at the massive window of the Galactic Council chambers on Nexus Prime, watching the endless stream of ships moving through space like glowing dots against the darkness. 200 years had passed since humanity joined the galactic community, and for every one of those years they had been the ones everyone turned to when things went wrong. Human engineers built the hyperspace lanes that connected distant worlds. Human doctors created vaccines that saved entire species from extinction. Human diplomats solved trade disputes that could have sparked wars across the galaxy. The Council chamber buzzed with activity as representatives from dozens of species debated the latest crisis. The Zapirian Empire had been expanding their territory for months now, taking neutral systems by force and enslaving or killing anyone who resisted. Jake had presented evidence of their war crimes to the Council 3 times in the past month. Each time the other species found excuses to ignore the growing threat. The Velkhans, with their tall, elegant frames and superior attitudes, dismissed human concerns as emotional overreaction. They spoke in their refined voices about the need for careful deliberation and proper protocols. The Corfac military representatives, with their thick armor and battle scars, claimed that conquest was natural and the weak deserved their fate. The Nexari traders calculated profit margins and worried only about how war might disrupt their commercial routes. Jake watched Captain Lisa Ford present the latest intelligence reports about Zapirian activities. She had spent weeks gathering evidence from border systems where the Zapirians had attacked civilian populations. Her voice remained steady as she described entire cities being bombed and survivors being taken as slaves. The holographic displays showed burning colonies and mass graves. The Velkhans representative waved a dismissive hand and spoke about the need for verified sources. The Corfac delegate grunted that warfare always created casualties. The Nexari counselor asked if there was any economic benefit to intervention. Jake felt his jaw clench as he watched these beings who called themselves civilized ignore clear evidence of genocide. 3 days later, the emergency session was called. The Zapirians had attacked Harmony Station, a human colony world in the Outer Rim. Jake stared at the incoming reports with growing horror as the numbers climbed. 50,000 civilians dead in the first wave of bombing. The orbital platforms destroyed. Ground forces moving through the settlements executing anyone they found. Peter Walsh was one of the colony administrators who managed to reach a communication station before the Zapirians found him. His final broadcast went out across the galaxy, showing Zapirian soldiers gunning down children who tried to run. His voice broke as he spoke about his daughter Maria, who had been killed trying to protect younger kids at the school. The transmission ended with the sound of weapons fire and Peter's scream. When the evidence reached the Council, Jake expected immediate action. Instead, he watched 2 weeks of debate about proper procedures and diplomatic protocols. The Velkhans suggested sending a strongly worded message expressing concern. The Corfac proposed that humans should handle their own problems. The Nexari worried about trade sanctions affecting their profit margins. Admiral Kate Sullivan arrived from Earth with new orders sealed in diplomatic pouches. She was a woman who had served in the Outer Rim for 30 years and had seen humanity's slow transformation from grateful junior partners to the backbone of galactic civilization. Her weathered face showed no emotion as she opened the sealed instructions and read them to Jake. The final council session came on a Tuesday. President Carlos Rivera addressed the assembled representatives via hologram from Earth. His words were simple and direct, without the flowery diplomatic language, usually required for such occasions. He thanked the species who had worked alongside humanity and expressed disappointment in those who had chosen convenience over justice. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Humanity was withdrawing from the Galactic Council effective, immediately. All human personnel would be recalled from galactic positions within 72 hours. All human-built infrastructure would be abandoned. All human technology and assistance would be terminated. The galaxy would have to manage without them. The reaction was immediate chaos. Velcon's delegates demanded explanations about proper procedures. Corfac representatives threatened consequences for abandoning military obligations. Nexari counselors calculated the economic impact and began panicking about trade route maintenance. Jake watched it all with grim satisfaction. For 2 centuries, humanity had built, maintained, and protected galactic civilization. They had been taken for granted, insulted, and dismissed at every turn. When they asked for justice for their murdered children, they were told to be patient and follow procedures. Within hours, human ships began leaving their stations. Engineers shut down systems they had built and maintained for decades. Doctors packed up medical equipment that had saved millions of lives. Teachers closed schools where they had educated alien children alongside human ones. The Great Exodus had begun, and the galaxy was about to learn what they had lost. 3 months after the last human ship disappeared from galactic space, the first hyperspace junction failed near Velcon's territory. Director Alan Brooks had been the chief engineer for the Galactic Transit Network for 15 years, and his warnings to the Council had been dismissed as human dramatics. The aliens thought hyperspace lanes were like rivers that flowed naturally through space, but Alan knew better. The junction at Sector 7 had been maintained by a team of human engineers who understood the delicate balance of gravitational fields and exotic matter that kept the hyperspace corridors stable. When they left, they took with them 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge about hyperspace physics that no other species had bothered to learn. The aliens had been content to use the lanes without understanding how they worked. Captain Roy Kim had managed the central logistics hub that coordinated shipping routes across 17 systems. His team of human programmers had written the algorithms that calculated optimal shipping paths and managed cargo distribution. When Roy received the withdrawal orders, he wiped the central computers and took the source code with him. The Nexari traders discovered that their entire economic system depended on human-designed software that they could not replicate. Food distribution networks began failing within weeks. Colonies that had relied on regular supply shipments found themselves facing starvation as cargo ships wandered lost through space without proper navigation systems. The automated farming stations that fed billions of people across the galaxy shut down when their human-programmed maintenance cycles expired, and no one knew how to restart them. General Nina Hayes had been the chief technical advisor to the Corfac military for 12 years. She had helped them upgrade their weapon systems and taught their engineers how to maintain their most advanced equipment. When she left, she took with her the technical manuals and override codes that the Corfac had never bothered to learn. Their proud war machines began breaking down as components failed, and no one knew how to repair them. The industrial world of Corvex 9 had been the manufacturing center for 3 star systems, producing everything from basic tools to advanced spacecraft. Engineer Sam Torres had designed and built the massive fusion reactors that powered the planet's factories. The aliens who worked there had learned to operate the machines, but Sam had never shared the reactor maintenance protocols or the emergency shutdown procedures. When Sam left, he initiated a controlled shutdown of all 6 reactors. The aliens frantically tried to restart them, but without the proper codes and procedures, they only managed to trigger the automatic safety systems. Corvex 9 went dark, and with it the industrial capacity that supported dozens of worlds. Entire civilizations found themselves unable to produce the basic tools they needed for survival. Dr. Rachel Stone had been the head of galactic medical research for 20 years. Her teams had developed treatments for diseases that plagued various alien species and created vaccines that prevented countless deaths. When the humans withdrew, they took with them not just their knowledge, but also the production facilities and equipment needed to manufacture life-saving medicines. Plagues that had been controlled for decades began returning. The Zapirians, who had expanded too quickly into territories with different disease environments, found their immune systems failing. Worlds they had conquered became death traps, as biological agents they had never encountered began spreading through their population. Their military found itself fighting two wars, one against rebels and another against invisible enemies that killed from within. The Velkhans discovered that their elegant cities with their soaring towers and artistic gardens required constant maintenance by human engineering teams. The environmental systems that controlled temperature and air quality had been designed by humans who understood the complex interactions between different atmospheric components. Without proper maintenance, the cities began experiencing system failures that made them barely habitable. Council Chairman Zelk of the Velkhans sent increasingly desperate messages to Earth. The first were formal diplomatic protests about breach of contract. Then came requests for technical assistance. Finally came pleading transmissions offering vast sums of money for even basic maintenance information. All went unanswered as Earth had gone completely silent. The Nexari attempted to hire human freelancers to fix their failing systems, but discovered that every human in the galaxy had returned to Earth or human-controlled space. Even humans who had been married to aliens or had lived among other species for decades had answered the call to return home. It was as if humanity had decided collectively that their time among the stars was over. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for centuries became chaotic as ships got lost in hyperspace or emerged in wrong systems. Pirates who had been kept in check by human patrol fleets began raiding defenseless cargo vessels. The galactic economy that had grown wealthy and stable under human guidance collapsed into chaos within months. The Corfac military tried to maintain order through force, but their weapons kept malfunctioning and their ships broke down faster than they could repair them. Their proud warrior culture discovered that 2 centuries of relying on human engineers had left them helpless when their technology failed. Ancient fighting skills meant nothing when your weapons would not fire and your ships could not fly. Some worlds tried to contact Earth directly, but received only automated messages stating that Earth was no longer accepting communications from non-human sources. The blue planet that had once been eager to help anyone in need had turned its back on the galaxy and pulled up the ladder behind departing humanity. The galaxy was learning a harsh lesson about taking for granted the people who made civilization possible. 1 year after the Great Withdrawal, the shipyards of Earth worked in complete silence. Admiral Tony Clark supervised construction of vessels unlike anything humanity had built before. These were not exploration ships designed to discover new worlds or peacekeeping vessels meant to protect trade routes. These were weapons of war built with 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge about every species' weakness and vulnerability in the galaxy. The ships took shape in the orbital yards above, Earth massive and angular with armor plating that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Human engineers who had spent decades building for others now focused all their skills on creating instruments of destruction. Every system had been designed with specific enemies in mind, based on detailed knowledge of alien technology and tactics. Dr. Kevin Lee led the biological warfare research team that worked in secure laboratories beneath the surface of Luna. His scientists had spent the year analyzing genetic samples collected during 2 centuries of medical cooperation with alien species. They knew the precise structure of every alien immune system and had developed targeted biological agents that could cripple specific species while leaving others unharmed. Fleet Admiral Susan Parker stood on the bridge of the flagship Final Warning as the human fleet prepared to launch. She had served alongside alien officers for 30 years and knew their tactics better than they knew them themselves. Every battle plan, every strategic doctrine, every technological advancement the aliens possessed had been observed and analyzed by human military advisors who were now putting that knowledge to deadly use. The first target was a Zapirian military outpost on the edge of their expanding empire. The base housed 3,000 soldiers and served as a forward command center for raids into neutral space. It had been built using standard Zapirian defensive designs with overlapping shield generators and automated weapon platforms that the Zapirians believed made it impregnable. Colonel Mike Turner led the assault team that approached the base in ships designed to be invisible to Zapirian sensors. Human stealth technology had always been superior, but the aliens had never realized this because humans had never used it against them. The assault force moved through space like ghosts, arriving at the base without triggering a single alarm. The attack lasted 17 minutes. Human soldiers moved through the base corridors like death itself, eliminating every defender with surgical precision. They knew the layout because humans had designed the base construction software that the Zapirians used. They knew the weapon placements because humans had written the tactical programs that positioned them. They knew the patrol schedules because humans had created the duty roster algorithms. When it was over, the base simply went silent. No distress calls went out because the communications array had been the first target destroyed. No survivors remained because the humans had decided that mercy was a luxury they could no longer afford. Security recordings showed black-armored figures moving with deadly efficiency, leaving only empty corridors and cooling corpses behind. The psychological warfare began immediately. Humanity broadcast a single message across all Zapirian communication channels showing footage from the destroyed base. The message was delivered by General Peter Walsh, the survivor of Harmony Station, who now wore the uniform of Earth's military command. He stood among the ruins of his former home and spoke directly to the Zapirian leadership. His words were simple and terrible. Harmony Station remembered the children who had died screaming, the 50,000 civilians murdered in their homes. Remembered. The colony worlds burned and populations enslaved. Remembered. Humanity had kept a careful accounting of every crime, and now the bill was due. Payment would be collected in blood, and the currency would be measured in Zapirian lives. Warlord Thek of the Zapirian High Command dismissed the attack as a minor raid carried out by human terrorists. He mobilized the 3rd Battle Fleet to hunt down and destroy the human ships that dared challenge Zapirian might. 200 warships launched from the primary naval base, carrying enough firepower to reduce planets to rubble. The Zapirian fleet arrived at coordinates provided by the humans, expecting to find a small force of desperate refugees hiding in asteroid fields. Instead, they found empty space that suddenly filled with human warships as cloaking devices deactivated. The Zapirians realized with growing horror that they had flown directly into a carefully prepared trap. Battle Coordinator Helen Grant directed the engagement from the command ship Retribution. She had studied Zapirian fleet tactics for 15 years while serving as a human observer during their training exercises. Every maneuver they attempted had been predicted and countered before the battle began. The Zapirians found their formations disrupted by precisely targeted attacks that hit exactly the right ships at exactly the right moments. The human weapons had been specifically designed to penetrate Zapirian shields and armor. Projectiles that should have bounced harmlessly off enemy hulls instead tore through them like paper. Energy beams that should have been deflected by defensive fields instead cut through ships from bow to stern. The Zapirian fleet that had seemed so mighty suddenly looked fragile and helpless. 17 minutes after the battle began, the last Zapirian ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light. 200 warships had been reduced to scattered debris and expanding clouds of vapor. Not a single human vessel had been lost, and only minor damage had been reported to 3 ships. The battle had been less a fight than an execution. The recordings of the battle spread across the galaxy within hours. Species that had dismissed human military capabilities now watched in stunned silence as the most powerful fleet in Zapirian space was destroyed with casual efficiency. The humans had not. Just one, they had demonstrated that the fight had never been fair to begin with. News of the Zapirian fleet destruction spread across the galaxy like wildfire, carried by terrified refugees and panicked military communications. The other council species realized with growing horror that humanity had been holding back for 2 centuries. Every act of kindness, every moment of restraint, every peaceful solution had been a choice, not a limitation. The gentle giants who had built their civilization were revealing themselves as sleeping dragons who had finally been awakened. Commander Joe Miller received orders to proceed to the Corfac homeworld with Strike Force 7. The proud warrior, species that had mocked human weakness and called them soft, would learn that humans understood warfare better than any species in the galaxy. The Corfac had spent centuries perfecting the art of brutal conquest, but humans had spent that same time studying them and preparing for this day. The Corfac military academies taught battle tactics that had been developed by human military advisors during the early years of galactic cooperation. Every strategic doctrine, every combat formation, every technological innovation the Corfac considered their own had been influenced or created entirely by human officers who worked alongside them. The irony was lost on the Corfac leadership, who had convinced themselves that humans were naturally weak and pacifistic. General Lisa Martinez commanded the human assault force that emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Corfac system. Her ships moved in perfect formation using maneuvers that the Corfac recognized with growing dread. These were their own tactical patterns being used against them with a precision and efficiency that surpassed anything they had achieved. The humans had learned from the best teachers in the galaxy, and those teachers had been themselves. The Corfac defense fleet moved to intercept the human ships, confident in their superior numbers and firepower. They had 200 heavily armed vessels against 50 human ships, and their commanders expected an easy victory. The first sign that something was wrong came when their weapons systems began malfunctioning as they approached optimal firing range. Every Corfac ship had been built using components designed and manufactured by human industrial complexes. The weapons targeting systems, navigation computers, and shield generators all contained human-made parts that the Corfac had never examined too closely. They assumed that technology was technology and never wondered why the humans were so eager to help them build better weapons. Captain Amy Davis activated the hidden protocols that human engineers had embedded in Corfac military hardware decades earlier. The back doors had been placed there as insurance against the day when the warrior species might turn against their human allies. That day had come, and the insurance policy was about to pay devastating dividends. Corfac weapons turned on their own ships as targeting systems identified friendly vessels as enemy targets. Shield generators overloaded and exploded, creating holes in defensive formations. Navigation computers sent ships careening into each other as pilots lost control of vessels they thought they understood. In 6 hours, the mighty Corfac defense fleet had been reduced to drifting wreckage and scattered survivors. The planetary bombardment that followed was surgical and precise. Human forces targeted military installations, government buildings, and industrial centers, while leaving civilian areas largely untouched. The Corfac population watched from their homes as 2 centuries of military pride was dismantled with clockwork efficiency. Their warrior culture had been built on the foundation of human support, and when that foundation was removed, everything collapsed. The Nexari attempted to negotiate before the human fleet could reach their territory. Ambassador Frank Roberts received their desperate offers of vast wealth and exclusive trading rights in exchange for mercy. His response was delivered via public broadcast to ensure that every species in the galaxy could hear humanity's position. The Nexari had traded in human suffering when they chose profit over justice, and now they would learn the true cost of that decision. Economic warfare followed as human ships moved through Nexari space, targeting not cities or fleets, but the financial infrastructure that kept their civilization running. Every trade route, every commercial hub, every financial center faced systematic destruction. But this was not random violence. It was calculated dismantling designed to collapse their economy while preserving the basic infrastructure needed to keep civilian populations alive. The humans had studied Nexari commerce for 2 centuries and knew exactly which facilities to destroy to bring down their entire economic system. Banking centers that processed interstellar transactions were reduced to rubble. Shipping coordination hubs that managed cargo flows across dozens of systems went silent. Manufacturing plants that produced trade goods for export were systematically demolished. The Velkhans, watching the pattern of human attacks, realized that their communications networks, defense grids, and governmental systems all ran on human-designed architecture. Tech specialist Gary Wilson had spent years working on Velkhans' infrastructure projects and had quietly embedded backdoors and override codes into every system he touched. The elegant towers and artistic cities that the Velkhans took such pride in had been built on a foundation of human engineering. When Gary activated the hidden protocols from his command ship, the results were immediate and devastating. Government buildings lost power as electrical systems shut down. Defense platforms went dark as their control systems crashed. Communication networks fell silent as routing protocols deleted themselves. The Velkhans discovered that their entire civilization was held together by human technology that could be turned off like a light switch. The Galactic Council tried to convene emergency sessions, but found that even their meeting facilities depended on human-built systems. The Great Assembly Hall on Nexus Prime had been designed by human architects and maintained by human engineers. When those engineers received orders to demonstrate humanity's capabilities, the station began experiencing cascading system failures. Species that had dismissed human warnings about the Zapirians now begged for mercy as human fleets moved through, their territory like unstoppable forces of nature. The same tactical brilliance that had once protected galactic shipping lanes was now being used to destroy the civilizations that had betrayed humanity's trust. The message was clear to anyone who cared to listen. Humanity had extended their hand in friendship for 2 centuries and had been repaid with dismissal, contempt, and betrayal. When their children were murdered and their colonies burned, the galaxy had chosen convenience over justice. Now, justice would be delivered on humanity's terms and at humanity's pace. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, but it was already too late for politics or diplomacy. Humanity no longer recognized their authority or acknowledged their right to govern galactic affairs. Fleet Marshal Kate Sullivan coordinated the final phase of operations from Earth's rebuilt defense platforms, watching as 2 centuries of careful planning reached its inevitable conclusion. The siege of Nexus Prime began without a single shot being fired. The massive space station that served as the galactic capital simply began experiencing system failures that cascaded through every level of its infrastructure. Life support systems flickered on and off, creating pockets of unbreathable atmosphere. Gravity generators failed in rotating patterns, causing panic as beings floated helplessly in corridors they had walked safely for decades. Engineering Chief Chris Thompson had been part of the original construction team that built Nexus Prime 40 years earlier. He had designed backup systems and emergency protocols that were hidden so deep in the station's architecture that even the maintenance crews did not know they existed. Every critical system had been given a human-designed heart that could be stopped remotely when the time came for judgment. The aliens aboard the station realized with growing terror that they were completely dependent on technologies they had never bothered to understand. The Velkhans, who prided themselves on their sophisticated culture, discovered that their elegant chambers were tombs without human-maintained life support. The Corfac, who trusted only in strength, found themselves helpless when the artificial gravity failed and their heavy frames became liabilities in zero gravity. Dr. Paula Anderson's research team activated dormant protocols that had been waiting for decades to be triggered. The station's main computer core began purging its memory banks, erasing centuries of accumulated data. Navigation systems forgot how to calculate hyperspace jumps. Communication arrays lost the ability to maintain contact with the outside galaxy. The mighty symbol of galactic civilization was becoming an isolated tomb drifting in empty space. The Nexari council members tried desperately to transfer their vast wealth to human accounts in exchange for restoration of basic services. They discovered that their financial networks had been designed by human programmers who had left behind hidden commands that could freeze or delete accounts at will. Centuries of accumulated wealth vanished into digital oblivion as the Nexari learned that money meant nothing when the people who built your civilization decided you were no longer worthy of their services. Surrender came from the most unexpected. Source: when Empress Kala of the Zapirian Empire broadcast a galaxy-wide transmission admitting guilt for the Harmony Station massacre. Her voice broke as she described the orders she had given to her military commanders and the innocent lives that had been lost in her quest for territorial expansion. She formally surrendered all Zapirian forces to human authority and begged for mercy for her remaining people. General Peter Walsh received the Empress's surrender personally aboard the human flagship Retribution. He stood in the same uniform he had worn as a colony administrator on Harmony Station before the Zapirians, destroyed his world and killed his family. The weight of 50,000 dead civilians stood behind him as he accepted the formal documents that ended the Zapirian Empire as an independent power. The trials that followed lasted for months as humanity established war crimes tribunals to judge the leaders who had participated in the Council's betrayal. Judge Alex Carter presided over proceedings that were broadcast across the galaxy, ensuring that every species could see justice being delivered with methodical precision. This was not vengeance carried out in anger, but judgment delivered with the cold certainty of natural law. The Zapirian military commanders who had ordered the massacre of civilians faced execution for their crimes. The Corfac generals who had dismissed human calls for justice were sentenced to life imprisonment on harsh frontier worlds. The Nexari trade leaders, who had calculated profit margins while innocents died, found their personal fortunes confiscated and distributed to the families of their victims. The Velcon's council members who had spoken of proper procedures while genocide was committed faced public humiliation as their elegant speeches were played alongside footage of burning human colonies. They were stripped of their titles and positions, forced to work as laborers rebuilding the worlds their inaction had helped destroy. But humanity's judgment went beyond punishing the guilty. Every species that had participated in the Council's betrayal would have their civilizations rebuilt under human guidance. This was not conquest for its own sake, but transformation designed to ensure that such betrayal could never happen again. The galaxy would be remade according to human values with human oversight and human justice. The new governmental structures being established on former council worlds emphasized individual rights and protections for minority populations. Species that had practiced slavery found those institutions dismantled overnight. Worlds where the strong had preyed upon the weak discovered that human administrators did not tolerate such behavior. Justice would be universal and blindfolded, caring nothing for species or status. Former enemies worked alongside human supervisors, learning governance based on principles rather than power. The Zapirians, who had once conquered through force now, helped rebuild the colonies they had destroyed. The Corfac, who had valued only strength, learned to protect the weak instead of exploiting them. The Nexari discovered that true prosperity came from fair trade rather than predatory commerce. The Galaxy was learning hard lessons about the consequences of betraying those who had given freely of their knowledge and protection. Humanity had extended their hand in friendship for 2 centuries, only to have it bitten by those they had tried to help. Now that hand would be extended again, but this time it would be backed by the absolute certainty that betrayal would not be tolerated or forgiven. The silence that had begun with humanity's withdrawal from galactic affairs was ending with the establishment of a new order built on foundations of justice and mutual respect rather than convenience and exploitation. 5 years after the Great Withdrawal, the galaxy had been completely transformed under the guidance of the Terran hegemony. The new government ruled not through conquest or oppression, but through the demonstrated reality that human leadership was the only path to lasting prosperity and peace. Former enemies had become willing partners in building a civilization based on justice rather than convenience. Director Nancy Scott oversaw the rehabilitation programs on former Council worlds, where alien populations learned new ways of living and governing. The species that had once dismissed human emotion as weakness discovered that human empathy combined with human strength created a stability they had never achieved on their own. Democracy replaced autocracy as ordinary citizens gained voices in their own governance. The Zapirian survivors worked under human supervision to rebuild the worlds they had once destroyed. On New Harmony, the memorial world built where Harmony Station had stood, former Zapirian soldiers labored alongside human colonists to create something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. General Klex, who had once commanded Zapirian occupation, forces now led construction teams that built schools and hospitals instead of military bases. The transformation was not limited to the former enemies. Species that had remained neutral during the crisis found themselves invited to join the new galactic order as equal partners rather than junior members. The Terran hegemony offered genuine cooperation based on mutual respect and shared values. Trade relationships were built on fair exchange rather than exploitation. Military alliances protected the weak instead of serving only the strong. President Maya Chen addressed the new Galactic Assembly from Earth, speaking to representatives who listened with the respect that humanity had always deserved but never received. The difference now was that this respect came from understanding rather than fear. The galaxy had learned that human patience was not weakness and human kindness was not naivety. Both were choices that could be withdrawn when betrayed. The new motto of the Terran hegemony was inscribed on every government-building space station and starship, serving as both promise and warning to all who saw it. We extend our hand in friendship, but we do not extend it twice. The words reminded everyone that humanity had given the galaxy a chance to choose justice over convenience, and the galaxy had failed that test. There would not be another opportunity to make the wrong choice. Fleet Admiral Susan Parker now served as head of Galactic Defense, ensuring that the peace was maintained through strength rather than empty words. The human fleets that patrolled the hyperspace lanes were no longer peacekeepers trying to mediate between hostile factions. They were enforcers of justice who would respond swiftly and decisively to any threat against innocent populations. The economic recovery that followed the establishment of human leadership surprised even the most optimistic projections. Trade. Routes that had been chaotic during the collapse were reorganized with human efficiency. The industrial capacity that had been lost when human engineers withdrew was rebuilt with improved designs and better safety protocols. Prosperity returned to the galaxy, but this time it was shared more fairly among all populations. Educational reforms ensured that future generations would understand the lessons of the recent crisis. Children of all species learned about the importance of justice and the consequences of betraying trust. History classes taught about the Harmony Station massacre and the Council's failure to respond appropriately. The goal was to ensure that such betrayal would never happen again. The Velcons, who had once spoken eloquently about proper procedures, learned to implement justice quickly and efficiently. Their elegant cities were rebuilt with human-designed safety systems that actually protected inhabitants instead of just looking impressive. Art and culture flourished under the new system as creativity was channeled toward building rather than displaying superiority. The Corfac military was restructured to serve as protectors rather than conquerors. Their warrior traditions were preserved but redirected toward defending the innocent and maintaining order. Former enemies of other species found themselves working together under human leadership, discovering that cooperation was more effective than competition. The Nexari trade networks were rebuilt on principles of fair exchange and mutual benefit. The predatory practices that had enriched a few at the expense of many were eliminated. Commerce flowed freely, but under regulations that protected smaller traders and prevented exploitation of developing worlds. Prosperity was shared rather than hoarded. On Earth itself, the population looked back on 2 centuries of service to an ungrateful galaxy with mixed emotions. The cost had been high, measured in lives lost and trust betrayed. But the final result was a galaxy that reflected human values of justice, fairness, and mutual respect. The sacrifice had been worth making, even though it should never have been necessary. The galaxy had learned too late that humanity's greatest strength was never their technology or their tactics. It was their restraint and their willingness to serve others before themselves. When that restraint was finally withdrawn and that service was denied, the consequences had been swift and terrible. But from the ashes of the old order, something better had emerged. The humans had indeed left in silence when their patience was exhausted. They had delivered judgment when their warnings were ignored. They had brought annihilation to the corrupt systems that valued power over justice. But in the end, they had not destroyed the galaxy. They had saved it from itself and given it a chance to become something worthy of the sacrifices that had been made. The new order would endure because it was built on foundations of justice rather than convenience. The galaxy finally had the leadership it needed, even though it had taken a terrible lesson to accept that leadership willingly.